Hello creative people and welcome to today's video. I'm going to be comparing the cheapest watercolor set I could find to my usual setup to see if you really need expensive watercolor paints when you're just starting out. Alrighty, let's jump right into it. So we're starting with the less expensive side first. I just sketched out a little doodle of this elf lady walking her dragon dog, and there are two little fairies that are one of them's bringing home their groceries. It's got a little tiny shopping bag there, and the other one is feeding the dog a bone. Nothing too deep here or meaningful, just a cute little illustration to test out these paints. I have replicated this on the expensive paper, as you'll see later. I've lined these both with a micron pen, which is waterproof and archival, which basically means it's not going to degrade over time, and it's also not going to bleed into the watercolor that I'm putting down. I didn't include this in the cost breakdown that I'm going to be doing in a minute, just because I don't think it's necessary to get started with watercolors. This was mostly just for ease of filming, so that you guys can see what I'm working on, and so that it's super clear where these shapes are and what's going on the page. So this watercolor set on sale when I purchased it was $4, roughly Canadian. Normally it's about $8, but for 36 different colors, lots of mixing space, a decent amount of paint, I think that's super reasonable. The brushes that I'm using are Artist Loft brushes. The pack that I purchased was about $8. This was a 10-piece set. I'll show a quick clip of that on screen now. But this set, basically, it has a couple of flat brushes, a couple of rounds, it has a fan. Finally, I got some Strathmore watercolor paper, which is a pretty reasonable brand. It's a brand of paper that I've used before and been very happy with. I had the option of buying Artist Loft watercolor paper while I was there, but honestly, because I haven't used it before, I just wanted to eliminate that kind of uncertainty just in case, and the price difference between the Strathmore and the Artist Loft really wasn't that different, so I chose to go with a brand that I am more familiar with. So all told, after accounting for taxes and everything, I was able to get the brushes, the paper, and the paint for less than $20 Canadian. I know that it can be really expensive and quite intimidating getting into art for the first time. If I was just getting started out with watercolor painting again, I think I would be pretty overwhelmed by the variety of choices and options, and this 3-piece starter kit honestly has everything you need to get started and to paint for quite a while until you run out of paper, so I think that these are an excellent option for someone who is just starting out. And with that, we're going to jump right into the expensive side. So I'm just quickly cleaning off my palette, because obviously I didn't do that the last time I used it. I'm laying down a flat wash in the background, and I think right away you can see the difference in how that blue has laid down. It's pretty much a flat, consistent tone throughout the page. There's a little bit of variation, but nowhere near as much as we saw with the Artist Loft paints. You can also see that in the bushes and the leaves of the tree here. So immediately I'm noticing that I'm able to pick up pigment a lot more easily, and because I was used to using the cheaper paints, I've actually gone overboard here. You can see how much purple I've mixed for such a small area. I picked up way too much pigment because I was expecting to have to fight with the paint to get the color I needed, and that just didn't happen. One of the big differences when you're working with more expensive art supplies, and I've found more or less that this is consistent across the board, is that the final result that you get might not be super different, but the experience that you have laying those paints down, working with them, that is where the main difference lies. So you can ultimately pretty much get the exact same result on the other end, it's just a matter of how hard you have to fight to get there. Personally, I think that starting out with materials that are harder to work with probably teaches you more about how to deal with some of the idiosyncrasies of the medium, how to deal with some of the problems that might arise. It's a little bit like learning to ride your bike with no training wheels before you get the training wheels put on, which is kind of counterintuitive, but I do think that if you started with these paints and you know, muddled your way through, you would probably have an easier time once you went to the student or intermediate grade paints later on. And that's not to say that the cheaper paint wasn't fun to work with. I still had fun. I did a little swatch sheet with these, and they are super duper vibrant. You could do some great cute little illustrations with them. So it was still fun. It just definitely came with some extra challenges and some areas where I had to spend a little bit more time to get the result that I wanted. You can also see that for this piece I'm mostly using one brush, whereas for the other piece I had to switch between like different sizes of rounds, a fan, all of that. I'll show you this trick later, but there's actually a way to make a fan brush out of a round brush if you're in a pinch. One thing that I would recommend as an initial upgrade if you are going to get these watercolor paints, I think the best place to spend your money first, if you do want to add to this kit, is to get a nice, like, decent quality small detail brush. I think this is one place where the other brushes really fell through. Just for me, because the brushes were a bit less snappy, it was very hard to get a thin line even with some of the smaller round brushes, and just the way that they held water was a little bit challenging to work with. Sometimes they held a little too much and it was hard to get them to come down to a really fine point. So if you've got these paints and you're thinking you want to upgrade a little bit, just bit by bit, I'd recommend getting a small detail brush to start, because that's going to make it a lot easier to get into those small shapes. Just glazing in some shadows now, finishing it up. I still have to get the color into the fairies, there we go. So yeah, ultimately, at first glance, these don't look that different. And I'll get more into some of the differences I noticed right away. Alright, so final thoughts. What do I think about these paints? Honestly, again, I got these for $4 on sale. They're usually $8 for this whole set. I think that's a really great deal for the quality of these and how much paint you get. So as long as you're mixing within the same color families, you're mixing your reds with your reds, your blues with your blues, you shouldn't really run into any trouble with muddy colors. And as you work with them, you'll figure out which pigments play nicely together. So, for example, I found this kind of a magenta here. Plays real nice with this down here. So you've got like a magenta, an ultramarine. You can kind of figure out where your core colors are going to be just by experimenting and mixing. You could even do a massive like swatch sheet, just mix and you play around and you figure out which ones play nice, and then you can leave yourself some notes. So yeah, I would highly recommend these to anyone who's getting started. Really didn't see much of a difference in the final products. Here's our cheap one. Here's the more expensive one. You can see it's a little more subtle over here. It was easier for me to get a flat wash with the paler cerulean than over here. But honestly, a lot of that just comes down to how it feels while you're working with it, which, you know, it was more challenging, slightly more challenging to work with the cheaper paints, but I think the final product looks pretty much exactly the same. If you're just starting watercolors, I don't know that I'd rush out to spend like $100 on the supplies. It can be a slightly controversial medium. I feel like people either love it or they hate it, so it's always good to try things before you really commit. And I think if you're on a budget, if you're trying out this new hobby, if you know like a young artist in your life, I think these are really, really great. I like the Artist Loft line. I think they have a lot of really great products. I think they make, you know, getting started with art really, really accessible, which is really exciting. You know, I firmly believe that everyone should have some kind of creative hobby. So yeah, I really have no major issues with these paints. I'm going to do a light fastness test, and I will let you guys know how that goes. I'll probably make a little short talking about the differences, but that is one thing that is worth considering when you're working with cheaper paints. If you do want to display what you're making, just be aware that a lot of the pigment will probably degrade. But even if these fade a lot, it's not a huge issue if you're working in watercolor sketchbooks, or if you're like me and you end up tucking all your stuff away in some dark corner because you don't want to look at it all the time. You know, there's a lot of learning that happens with painting. You're not going to be displaying every single thing you make, probably. You might be. If you do, that's cool too. But like, chances are when you're just starting out, you're not going to have like your walls covered in paintings. You're not going to have everything in direct sunlight. It's probably not a huge issue for most people. That concludes today's video. Feel free to check out any other videos on my channel. This is my like first real one, so more on the way. And I'll let you guys know how the light fastness test went. I hope you have a beautiful day, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.